Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The dust on Vos 4 had a way of getting into everything. Into the instruments, into the coffee filter, into the philosophical outlook. Eli Marsh had been on Caldera Reach for 7 months, and he had stopped fighting the dust approximately 6 months and 29 days ago, which he considered a reasonable adjustment period for a man who had once ironed his field shirts. He was 38 years old, employed by the Colonial Cartography Division as a survey specialist, which meant that he walked a great deal and talked to almost no one and filed reports that were read by a database before they were read by a person, if a person ever read them at all. He had a coffee machine that he trusted more than most institutions. He had a neighbor named Dumas who communicated primarily in load-bearing estimates, and once told Eli, with great sincerity, that the structural integrity of their shared wall was exceptional, which Eli had thanked him for without knowing what to do with. He had a cough that the settlement physician, a compact and perpetually skeptical woman named Dr. Osai, attributed to the iron particulate in the local atmosphere, and which Eli privately suspected was his body's way of expressing an opinion about his life choices. His quarters sat at the outer rim of Caldera Reach, which was not the prestigious end. The prestigious end, such as it was, occupied the central hub where the administration building stood with its reinforced walls and its satellite array, and its faint, continuous hum that the colonists had long since stopped hearing. The outer rim had better views and worse plumbing, and a wind that arrived every evening like an uninvited guest who didn't drink but still managed to knock things over. Eli had chosen it for the ridge visible from his east-facing window, a long basalt formation that turned a color at sunset that he had spent 3 weeks trying to name and eventually logged in his personal notes as almost rust but not apologizing for it. He was not unhappy. He was also not happy in any way that required witnesses. These two facts coexisted in him with the comfortable arrangement of long-term roommates who had learned not to discuss the dishes. On a Tuesday that had done nothing to distinguish itself from the Tuesdays before it, Eli opened his front door at 6:43 in the morning, stepped out to collect the atmospheric readings from the sensor on his exterior wall, and found an envelope on his doorstep. There was no name on it, not his, not anyone's. On the front, in place of an address, someone had drawn a small sketch of the northeastern ridge, his ridge, the almost just one, in ink so precise it looked like it had been laid down with an instrument rather than a hand. He looked left, he looked right. The outer rim path was empty in both directions, which it generally was at this hour because the other outer rim residents were either still asleep or sensible people. He picked it up. He went inside. He opened it over his coffee, which felt like the appropriate context for unexpected correspondence, and found a single sheet of paper covered in handwriting, so even it briefly made him doubt it was handwriting at all. He read it once. He read it again. Then he set it on the table beside his cup and looked at it the way he looked at survey anomalies, with the particular attention of someone trying to determine whether a thing is interesting or just wrong. The letter contained one question. Do humans always name the things they are afraid of, or only the things they love? There was nothing else. No signature, no pleasantry, no explanation for why this question had been delivered to his specific doorstep at 6:43 in the morning by an apparently invisible person with exceptional penmanship. His first, most reasonable thought was that it was intended for someone else, and had arrived at his door by error. His second thought, arriving approximately 4 seconds later with the quiet confidence of a thought that knows it is correct, was that there was no one else on the outer rim path who received personal correspondence of any kind, himself included, and that the drawing on the front was of a ridge visible specifically from his window and not from anyone else's. His third thought was that he should probably report this to someone, and his fourth thought was that he had absolutely no idea to whom one reported an unsigned philosophical letter, and that attempting to do so would make him sound like a man having a very specific kind of breakdown. He drank his coffee. He looked at the letter. The letter did not clarify itself. He went to work. He walked 8 kilometers of basalt terrain with his survey instruments and his cough and the question sitting in his mind like a stone in a boot, not unbearable, but impossible to ignore. He named things all day as he always did. Waypoint 7, Feature Delta 9, Geological Formation Class C, Southeast Facing. He thought about what it meant to name something. He thought about whether naming was love or fear, or just the brain's insistence on handles. By the time he returned to the outer rim in the evening, he had thought about the letter 41 times. He counted because he was a man who counted things. 41 times, which was 39 more than he had thought about anything else that day, including where he had put his secondary calibration tool, which turned out to have been in his pocket the entire time. He made dinner. He read the letter again. He considered for a long moment, leaving a reply under the doormat, and then decided this was either a perfectly natural response or the beginning of something he should think more carefully about, and that he would sleep on it. He did not sleep especially well. The next morning there was another envelope. The second letter asked whether it was true that humans once had a season called autumn, in which trees shed their leaves on purpose, and if so, whether they mourned them after. Eli read this at his kitchen table with his coffee, and the particular expression of a man confronting something he does not know how to file. He had grown up in a city where the trees were decorative and climate-controlled, and shed nothing without a maintenance request, so his personal relationship with autumn was largely theoretical. He wrote this in his reply, which he left under the doormat that night with the self-consciousness of a person performing an action he refuses to call romantic. He also wrote that he thought the question was extraordinary, which was true, and that he had no idea who was asking it, which was also true, and that he was beginning to find the combination of these two truths somewhat difficult to sleep through. He had started asking around, carefully, the way a man asks around when he is absolutely certain he is being subtle and is, in fact, being the opposite of subtle in a way that everyone can see but is too polite to mention. He asked Dumas first, because Dumas was nearest, and because Eli held a private theory that engineers, being systematic people, were more likely to know things about the settlement's inhabitants. Dumas listened to the question. Had Eli noticed anyone who wrote unusually well, who was perhaps literary, thoughtful, given to philosophical inquiry? And then said that the moisture seal on their shared wall was holding at 93% efficiency, which he found very encouraging. Eli thanked him and left, having learned nothing except that Dumas' conversational range was even more specialized than he had previously understood. He asked Priya, the settlement's schoolteacher, who demanded to see the letters before offering any opinion, read both of them standing in her doorway without inviting him in, and then said that whoever had written them was either a poet or someone who had suffered considerably, and that in her experience these were the same person wearing different coats. She handed the letters back with the reverence of someone returning a borrowed book. She also said that she herself was not the author, which Eli had not asked but was grateful to have confirmed. The third letter arrived on a morning when the wind had been particularly ambitious overnight, and had rearranged several things on Eli's exterior shelf that he had believed to be secure. The envelope was undamaged. He thought about this more than was probably warranted, that the letters arrived regardless, intact, regardless of atmospheric conditions, as though whatever system delivered them was not subject to the same indignities as everything else on the outer rim. The letter inside asked whether Eli found it strange to spend his days naming places that already existed before the names arrived, and whether the places minded. He sat down and laughed, alone in his kitchen, the full and genuine kind, and then felt the laugh shift into something more complicated as he reread the question, and understood that it wasn't entirely a joke. By the end of the third week he had established, through a process of inquiry that he described to himself as methodical, and that Priya, upon being updated, described as adorably misguided, that the author was almost certainly not any of the following people. Dumas, Priya herself, the supply coordinator whose name was Vetch and who communicated in inventory numbers. The hydroponics team lead who was brilliant but whose written communications Eli had seen on the communal notice board, and who spelled several common words in ways that suggested a complex private relationship with the alphabet. Or a man named Ort who lived 3 doors down and claimed to have seen everything, and turned out to have seen mostly the inside of the communal cafeteria, where he held strong opinions about the protein allocation schedule. This eliminated 11 of Caldera Reach's 43 adult residents. It was not fast progress. Eli remained committed to the process. What was faster and considerably less comfortable was the way the letters were changing him. He noticed it first in the field, standing on the basalt ridge at midday with his instruments beeping their small, contented beeps, and finding himself composing sentences in his head. Not survey notes. Sentences. Observations about the way the light moved across the plateau, or thoughts about whether a place could be lonely in some structural sense. The way a room without furniture is not sad but is unmistakably aware of its own emptiness. He had never done this before. He had previously used the long hours of field work to think about logistics, or to have the same 5 memories on rotation, or to count his steps without meaning to. Now he had company somehow, and the company was made of questions someone left at his door in the dark. He was starting to understand something about the letters that he could not quite hold still long enough to examine directly. They were not casual. The questions were not small talk approximating depth. They were genuinely searching, moving around something the way you move around a room when you're looking for something you've lost and can't name. Someone was working something out, and they were working it out with him, and they had chosen him specifically, and he could not decide if this was flattering or alarming or some new third thing, for which Caldera Reach had not yet developed the vocabulary. He left his reply that night, longer than usual. He wrote about cartography and what it meant to name a thing that didn't ask to be named. He wrote about the valley he'd once surveyed that the database had designated Sector 7C, and how the designation had briefly made him unable to see it the way he had before. He wrote that he thought names were not for the things named but for the people doing the naming, which meant they said more about longing than about geography. He put it under the mat. He stood up. He went inside. In the morning, the reply was gone, and there was a new letter, and the new letter had read what he wrote. 3 months in, Eli had stopped pretending the letters were a mystery he was actively solving and started treating them as a fact of life, the way he had learned to treat the dust and the wind and the beeping of his instruments. They arrived every morning. He replied every night. The rhythm of it had embedded itself into his days so completely that on the one morning a letter was delayed, held back. He later realized, by the same atmospheric interference that knocked out the settlement's eastern comms array for 6 hours. He had stood at his open door in the amber light for a full minute, cup in hand, feeling a disorientation so specific it embarrassed him. He did not tell Priya about this. He told Priya almost everything at this point, which was something he had not intended and which had come about gradually, the way most things he had not intended came about, which was through the simple mechanism of Priya asking direct questions and Eli being constitutionally unable to lie to someone who looked at him with that particular quality of patient attention. But he did not tell her about the minute at the door. Some feelings deserved a private address. What he did tell her was that the letters had begun to change, that the questions were no longer abstract inquiries about human customs or the philosophy of place, but something closer, something that moved around a specific center of gravity. The author had written, in the letter he now thought of as the 53rd because he had begun numbering them in his notebook, that she found authority to be a particular kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being seen through a role instead of as a person, of having every word you say weighted by something other than what you mean. She had written that she thought this might be incurable, which Eli had found devastating in a quiet and unannounced way that stayed with him for several days. Priya, upon being told this, set down her tea and said that whoever was writing to him was not working something out. She was asking for help. These, Priya said, were different activities that people frequently confused because the first one sounded more dignified. The science on Vos 4 had a way of intruding on personal realizations. The settlement's atmospheric processors ran a cycle every evening that produced, for approximately 11 minutes, a low harmonic frequency that the colonists had named the hum, and which the Colonial Engineering Division had described in its official report as an acoustical byproduct of thermal regulation, and which Eli experienced as the universe briefly clearing its throat. It was during the hum on an evening in the 4th month that he sat at his kitchen table with the 58th letter and understood that he was in considerable trouble. The letter had asked him whether it was possible to know someone you had never met. Not in the romantic sense, she had specified, with a precision he found both charming and suspicious, as though she had written the romantic sense, reconsidered it, and replaced it with something that meant the same thing while technically meaning something different. In the structural sense, she wrote, whether knowing a person's mind, their particular way of moving through a question, the things they reach for when they're trying to say something true, whether that constituted knowing them, or whether proximity was required, whether the body in the room was irreplaceable data. He had written back that he thought proximity was overrated as an epistemic tool, that he had lived beside people for years and known them less well than he currently knew whoever was writing to him, that he could, if asked, describe the shape of her thinking the way he described terrain, where it rose, where it opened, where it moved carefully around the edges of something that mattered. He had written the word her for the first time, without annotation or apology, and put the letter under the mat, and gone to bed feeling the specific exposure of a man who has said a true thing out loud. Her response the following morning did not address the pronoun. It addressed the cartography metaphor, which she called generous and possibly accurate, and then it asked, in the same register of careful precision she used for everything she did not want to appear to be asking directly, whether he had ever mapped something and then been afraid to visit it. He had laughed again, the genuine kind which kept happening, which he regarded as one of the stranger developments of his time on Vos 4. He had a reputation, such as it was, for being a man of moderate affect. Dumas had once described him approvingly as very structurally stable, and Eli had accepted this as the compliment it was intended to be. He was not a man who laughed alone in his kitchen. He was becoming one, incrementally, letter by letter. It was Dumas, again without meaning to, who said the thing that mattered. They were sharing the communal table at the settlement cafeteria on a Thursday, with genuine enthusiasm, a variance he had found in the Eastern Foundation load, and Eli was performing the attentive expression he had developed for engineering conversations, when Dumas mentioned in passing that the administrator's posting had been extended. 4th year now. Nobody applied for a 4th year at a frontier posting, Dumas said, unless they had decided the place was theirs in some sense that the contract didn't cover. Eli said nothing. He ate his food. He looked at the middle distance where a person looks when arithmetic is happening that is not about numbers. He had seen the administrator twice, both times at a distance, which Caldera reaches geography made easy, and which his residence at the outer rim made easier. He knew her name, Sale, and that she was Verath, and that the Verath had been living alongside humans long enough that humans had mostly stopped noticing the ways they weren't human, which the Verath had probably noticed even if they had not mentioned it. He knew she was well-read because Priya had said so. He knew she had studied human cultural history before her posting, because the settlement's official profile said so. He knew that she worked late, and that she carried her position the way certain people carried things they were accustomed to carrying, without display, without complaint, with the quiet exhaustion of someone who has forgotten what it felt like to put it down. He did not let this thought complete itself. He was a scientist, functionally. He dealt in data. He had no data. He went home. He wrote a letter. He said that yes, he had mapped things he was afraid to visit, and that the fear was never of the place itself but of what he might find there, which was usually something he had already suspected and had found more manageable as a suspicion than it would be as a fact. He put it under the mat. The hum ran its 11 minutes. The amber dark settled over the outer rim. In the morning there was no letter, and then there was arriving later than usual, the envelope slightly different from the others, the handwriting the same but the pressure of it heavier, as though written quickly or with some urgency beneath the surface, carefully covered over. It said that she understood exactly what he meant, that there were things she had kept as suspicions for the same reason, that she was beginning to run out of reasons. Eli read it 4 times. He looked at the door. He thought about knocking on doors, about which doors, about whether a man who mapped places for a living was obligated to eventually visit them. He thought about this for the rest of the day with the focused intensity of someone doing anything but thinking about it. The windstorm arrived on a Wednesday, which Eli felt was poor scheduling on the planet's part. Voss 4 produced these storms 3 times a year with the reliability of an institution that takes pride in its consistency, and the settlement had protocols: secure the exterior equipment, run the structural integrity checks, stay indoors if you had any sense, which Caldera Reach's 43 adult residents had in varying quantities. Eli had spent the storm at his kitchen table writing a letter he was not sure he would leave under the mat, because it said things that felt too large for the mat's jurisdiction. He had been writing this particular letter for 3 days. The previous versions were in his recycler. There had been 7 previous versions, which was 6 more than any letter deserved, and which told him something about the letter that he was working very hard not to hear. The comms alert came at 9 in the evening, while the wind was making serious structural arguments against his east-facing window. A panel had come loose in the administration building. The settlement physician was across the settlement at a separate call. Could anyone in the outer rim sectors respond? It was not an emergency, the alert specified, and then listed the nature of the injury in a way that made Eli, who had basic field medical training, put on his coat before the message finished. He arrived at the administration building with his kit and the wind at his back, which was the wind's way of being helpful while also being terrible, and a settlement maintenance worker let him in with the expression of someone who has done what they can and is relieved to transfer the responsibility. The administrator's quarters were at the back of the building. He had never been in this part of the building. He had, in 7 months, never had occasion to be. He knocked. There was a pause, and then a voice told him to come in, and the voice was composed in the way that voices are composed when composure is being actively maintained against some resistance. He opened the door and stopped. The room was not what he had expected, though he would have struggled to say what he had expected. What he had not expected was the shelves. Specifically, the long shelf along the eastern wall that held, arranged in a sequence that he recognized with the immediate and absolute certainty of a man looking at his own handwriting, every letter he had written in 7 months. His envelopes, his words, kept with a neatness that indicated they had been handled many times and replaced carefully each time. The way you treat things that belong to a category you don't have a name for but know is important. Sale was on the medical cot by the window. She was watching him with the dark, still eyes of the Verath, which gave nothing away in the way that still water gives nothing away while reflecting everything. The faint luminescence at her temples was brighter than its usual quiet register. Her silver hair moved at its edges with the slight autonomous quality he had heard about and never been close enough to observe. She had a laceration along her left forearm that had been field-dressed by the maintenance worker and needed proper attention, and she was holding herself with the particular stillness of someone managing pain through the strategic deployment of dignity. He said, because it was the only thing available to him, "The letters were yours." She said, "The letters were yours. I only wrote them." He crossed to her and attended to the arm with the focused competence of someone grateful to have a task, because the alternative was standing in the middle of the room being unable to move. She did not look away while he worked. He was aware of this. He was aware of most things in the room to an unusual degree, the way awareness sharpens when it has been waiting for something. When he finished, she said, with the careful pace of someone who has decided to say a thing and is saying it before the decision reverses. She had seen him one morning returning from a survey. He had the instruments on his back and an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who has seen something that moved them and is carrying it home. She had wanted to ask him about it. Every channel she had was official. Administrator to resident, approval authority to approved party. She controlled his residency renewal, his survey access permissions, the resource allocation that made his work viable. She had counted the categories. There were 8. Eli said. You counted. She said, I count things when I'm nervous. He said before he could stop himself. I count my steps in the field without meaning to. Something in her face shifted in the way things shift when two pieces of information that have been kept separate are allowed into the same room. She told him that speaking to him through official channels would have made every word she said into something weighted, something he would have had to respond to not as a person, but as a resident speaking to an authority. And she had needed, specifically and urgently, to not be an authority for a little while. She had needed to be someone who was allowed to ask a question and receive an answer that was just an answer. So she had written a letter in the dark, she said, and left it at the door of the only person in Caldera Reach she actually wanted to talk to, and then gone back to her quarters and experienced several hours of what she described as moderate professional regret. And then his reply had appeared under her own door, and she had read it at 6 in the morning and had not put it down for a long time. Eli looked at his letters on the shelf. 7 months of honest correspondence, the real versions, the ones he had written after recycling the careful ones. All of them here. All of them kept. He said, You still have authority over my residency. She said, Yes. He said, This changes things. She said, Everything or nothing. The medication is making it difficult to determine which. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the particular quality of someone who has put down something heavy and is waiting to find out whether the floor holds. The luminescence at her temples was doing the thing it did when she was feeling something. He had read about this. He had not expected to be present for it. He found that presence was, as she had written to him once, irreplaceable data. He said, You could have knocked. She said, I'm the administrator. When I knock, it isn't knocking. It's a summons. He said, Then I'll knock. She was quiet for a moment. The wind outside had begun to lose its argument with the building and was now making the smaller complaints of something winding down. The atmospheric processors ran their cycle, and the hum moved through the walls. And Eli sat in the administrator's quarters in the middle of the night, surrounded by evidence of 7 months of being known, and felt something in him settle into a new position with the quiet finality of a cartographic correction. Not a dramatic revision, just the map becoming more accurate than it was before. He stayed until the physician arrived. He read one of her letters while he waited, one of the early ones, the question about autumn and the leaves, and Sale slept lightly against the pain medication, her silver hair still, the light at her temples at its softest register. He walked home through the post-storm air, which smelled of iron and something almost like rain, and the amber dawn was beginning its usual work on the dust. He reached his door. He looked at the mat. There was no letter. For the first time in 6 months, there was no letter, and the doorstep was simply a doorstep, belonging to a man who had spent 7 months being mapped by someone who needed him not to know she was doing it, and who had mapped her back without knowing that was what it was. He went inside. He made coffee. He sat at the table where the first letter had arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday and changed the orientation of everything that followed. He thought about the ridge, the almost just one. He thought about what he would name it now, if he were naming it today,